Welcome to the second part of this lecture. Now we shall be dealing the actual martyrial literature. Christian literature from the 2nd century onwards has presented martyrdom in various forms, and these can be grouped into two sections. First and foremost, we find the accounts of martyrdom. And secondly, we have another group of texts which offer reflections on martyrdom. Then each of these individual sections can be divided into different categories or different genres, we can say. For the time being, we shall discuss in detail only the texts coming from the first section, therefore the accounts of martyrdom. The texts of the second section include treatises, homilies, and even sometimes exhortations, which will be presented in future lectures when we are dealing different other kinds of literature. So, accounts of martyrdom can now be divided into three categories. First, there are the so-called martyria, which are narrations of martyrdoms, usually in letters. Then we have the so-called acta martyrum, the acts of the martyrs. And finally, we have the passiones martyrum, the passions of the martyrs. These three styles developed independently but simultaneously in the years between 150 and 200. So the second part of the 2nd century was actually the time when this literature was slowly developing. All of these fall under the category of hagiographical texts. And these are the texts that, as we have explained, deal with the saints. Hagiography, may I remind you, comes from the two Greek words hagios and graphe. So hagios means saint, and graphe means writing, therefore the writings on the saints. Now at this point it is important to say something about sainthood and holiness in Christianity. Okay, now nowadays, when we speak of saints, usually we imagine or we remember people whom we call saint this or saint that. They are usually people who are found in the liturgical calendar, and sometimes you may find an altar or a picture of them in some church. And usually saints nowadays become declared thus after a long process of research, which is called the canonization process. Okay, we know that at least there should be two miracles involved. Okay, so first the person's heroic values, the heroic way in which he or she lived their Christian lives has to be affirmed. Then the research starts to be made on the level of the diocese, and eventually it moves on to the level of the Holy See. After a first miracle is confirmed, the person is declared blessed, and eventually after a second miracle is confirmed, he is declared saint by the Pope or by his representative. However, in the past, sainthood was something completely different. Okay, first and foremost, as most of you probably know, there was no canonization process, which took long. Okay, people used to be declared as saints at the moment of their death. This process started roughly in the 12th or 13th century. But let us move back even further, and let's go back to the time of the apostles and of the time when the Bible was being written. So, who is the one who is holy? Only God is holy. Okay, so the only one who is holy is God. However, anything that belongs to God is sanctified. Okay, now anything that belongs to God could be either the offerings made by people or else the people or the things that he chooses for himself. Okay, so for example, if we keep to the Jewish religion, why was the temple area holy? We said in the previous part of this lecture that the Romans gave permission to the Jews to use their own coin while dealing with stuff in the temple area. And we said that was because the temple was holy. The temple was holy because it belonged to God. Because when it was built by order of God. And when it was built, it was consecrated to God. Therefore, it belongs to God. Therefore, it is holy. The sacrifices that the Jews used to offer to God, they were holy as well. The scrolls of the holy books. They were holy because they contained the word of God, and so on and so forth. So, in the same way, a person who dedicates his or her life to the service of God must strive to achieve this state of holiness. Okay, so a person, either because he feels a call or because God makes a particular sign that he wants him for himself, does not become holy automatically. A person has to do his part. Okay, he has to strive to reach this holiness. So, holiness and sanctity, which are the same thing, were therefore understood to be, by Christians at least, an interior quality. Okay, it was not something that was given by society. Now, if we read some pagan epitaphs or some pagan inscriptions, we do find sometimes a person defined as sanctus, even though he was not a Christian. The reason is because for the Romans, the title sanctus was given to a person who was usually a great benefactor of the city or of society. So, in this case, sanctus was a title that was given to someone who did something which was remarkable. In Christianity, it was completely different. The people who are called holy, the saints, were the people who strived for holiness in a very specific way. If we read the letters of St. Paul, for example, we will notice that most of his letters start with a salutation to the saints living in a particular city. Okay, I salute you, I greet you, you or the saints who are living in Corinth or in Ephesus. So practically we understand that in the New Testament, saints are all the believers in Christ. Okay, even in the Acts of the Apostles, sometimes we find the title of saints given to living people. So they are all who believe in Christ, who are saints. But in a particular way, those who are dead were regarded as saints as long as they were believers in Christ. Now, this definition of sainthood remained like this for about a century and a half, or right till about the year 150, where this kind of literature was starting to develop. With the introduction of the persecutions, now with the really heavy persecutions where people actually died and they were remembered, because as we said, there were some references to persecutions that happened earlier, even in the first century. However, let's say there weren't great numbers of people who seem to have died, and their names were hardly remembered. Okay, only the names of the apostles and their immediate disciples were remembered. So, with the introduction of harsher persecutions and persecutions became more and more frequent, the term saint, which in Greek we can call hagios and in Latin sanctus, as we have already said, came to be linked specifically to the martyrs. Okay, therefore, those who reached a level of holiness that was so exalted that they literally gave up their lives. Okay, so this is how we see the development of the meaning of this word. Okay, in pagan society, it was something which was given to remarkable people. For the first generations of Christians, everyone who believed in Christ was a saint. Eventually, only the martyrs were saints for the simple reason that they gave up their life. Okay, they reached such a level of perfection. I believe you remember our little discussion on perfection that we did in the previous part of this lecture. Okay, so whenever a person reaches this kind of perfection that literally leads him to death, then he is considered a saint by the community. Now, the first Christian text dealing with a martyrdom, therefore a narration of the martyrdom, and the text which set the model for all future martyrial accounts, is the stoning of Saint Stephen found in the 7th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. And what are the main points of this narration? First and foremost, Stephen is arrested. Eventually, he is tried in front of the Jews, and during this trial, he gives a very long speech on the history of salvation. I think if I were there, his very long speech would have been quite enough to get him stoned because it was never ending and he was all the time criticizing the Jews. Okay, so in such a way we can say that he got it on himself. But anyway, eventually Stephen was buried. He was stoned, sorry, before he was buried. Hopefully, he was not buried alive. But anyway, he was stoned, and eventually he was buried and he was mourned by the Christians. Now, St. Luke gives this very important detail. The Christian community wept for Stephen's death. They were not happy that Stephen was killed. And we try to keep this in mind when we come to dealing with the endings of the martyrial accounts that we shall be mentioning very, very soon. An interesting detail is that the last words and the actions of Saint Stephen repeat the last words and the actions of Christ on the cross. Namely, he prays for the forgiveness of those who killed him. And then he gives up his spirit to God. As you may remember, the crucifixion account ends exactly like this. Jesus, who calls to the Father and tells him not to count as a sin what the people were doing because they did not know what they were doing. And eventually he gives up his spirit. And this is exactly what we find in the Acts of the Apostles when Stephen is dying. Okay, so we can say that the moment when he reaches this highest point of perfection, the moment when he is divinized, apotheosis, is exactly when he forgives those who are killing him and when he gives his life to God. Okay, so that is the moment of divinization. So, during his trial, as we said, Stephen speaks at length about the history of salvation. So, there is this theme of this very long speech. Now, these are the same elements that became almost mandatory in all the hagiographical texts for the next 300 years. So, as long as there were martyrs, and as long as stories of martyrs continued to be written even after the end of the persecutions, these were the points that had to be included in some way or another. Now, we find sparse references to followers of Christ being killed in the book of Revelation. So, in the 6th chapter, for example, we have that vision of those who have followed the Lamb who are dressed in white and carrying palm branches because they have given up their lives. Okay, so the book of Revelation does make a faint mention of people who died because they followed Christ. In the letter to the Corinthians attributed to Clement, which we have mentioned a number of times, there is also a reference to, as we said, those heroic women who died even after enduring humiliating tortures. Okay, and this is found in chapter 2 of this letter. Now, these are enough to show that martyrdom from the very first years, remember, the letter of Clement was written at the end of the 1st century, while the book of Revelation was written around the turn of the 2nd century. So we are literally in the 2nd generation or the 1st generation of Christianity. So even from these early years, martyrdom was given a lot of importance by Christians. It was during this period that martyrs began to be regarded as a special group of people who eventually became the only ones who were deemed worthy to be called saints. Now, the narrations of martyrdoms in more detail than these short references started to come in the years after the letters of Saint Ignatius, with the account of the martyrdom of his friend Polycarp. So, as you can see, there was like, should I call it a divine plan? So first we find these little references here and there in the Acts of the Apostles, in the letter to Clement, in the letter of Clement, scusami, and then eventually in the book of Revelation. Then some years after the book of Revelation was written, we have Ignatius, who through his letters builds a theology of martyrdom. And after this, we start finding these texts. So it's kind of all the pieces are falling into chronological order by themselves. The first account, as we said, outside of the Bible, is the martyrdom of this Polycarp. Now, Polycarp, you might remember from our lecture on the sub-apostolic fathers, was a disciple or a friend of Ignatius. When Ignatius wrote those 7 letters, we had said that 6 of them were addressed to Christian communities in Asia Minor and the one in Rome. And the last letter was addressed to Polycarp, to the individual. This is the same Polycarp. Now Ignatius describes him as a young man when he wrote him this letter. Okay, so let's say in the 120s, Polycarp was still quite young. And he lived quite a long time because he was martyred, from what we understand, around the year 154. So he lived at least 30 more years after the letter he had received from Ignatius. So this account, the account of the martyrdom of Polycarp, is the first example that we have of hagiographical literature proper. The oldest text, therefore, comes from the community of Smyrna, which is modern-day Izmir. It is found in Turkey. However, within a few texts, or rather, maybe not a few months, a few years after, and other texts start appearing from all the areas of the Roman Empire. Okay, and I will just mention the first most important that we know of. So some years after, let's say about 5 years later, we have the Acts of the Martyrdom of Justin, which come from Rome. Then we have the Acts, the Martyrium of the Martyrs of Lugdunum, Lyon in France, Gaul. Okay, therefore, from Asia Minor, we have moved to Rome. From Rome, we have moved to France. Some years later, we have the Acts of the Martyrs of Scillium, which is in North Africa. Then we also have the Passion of Perpetua, some years after that, okay, which is also in North Africa. So slowly, you can see that all around the Mediterranean basin, where Christianity was flourishing, these texts were appearing. Okay, so it is as if in this particular period, after the year 154, the collective mentality of the Christians all over the empire found it the appropriate time to start writing about their heroes. Okay, and this is why I believe there was some kind of unseen plan, okay, because it was literally some time after Ignatius has set down the theology of martyrdom that people started viewing martyrdom as something that needed to be recorded. Okay, and I believe this is very interesting. Sometimes we say God works in mysterious ways, and I believe that even when it comes to the development of Christian literature, in some way or another, God was involved as well. Okay, because after all, these were texts which were written by people who believed firmly in God. Okay, so some kind of inspiration from God, I believe, even when it came to periods, to time periods, I think there is something too. So, the first 3 genres of hagiographical texts dealing with the martyrs, as we said, are the Martyria, the Acta, and the Passiones. So now we shall start seeing each of these in some detail. So let us start with the Martyria. So the Martyria, this is in the plural, okay? The singular would be the Martyrium. Now these were letters that were written from one community to another, in which accounts, narrations, descriptions of the martyrdoms of fellow Christians are given. So we can say that they are like news updates. In one of our first lectures, we had said that the first form of Christian literature was letters. Okay, there were the letters of St. Paul, but there were also other letters written by missionaries, okay, who used to write to their daughter communities to see how things were going. And we can put these kind of letters into that same category. There was some communication between different communities, and therefore they used to write letters with the updates of what was going on. Now, for example, the 2 most important martyria that we possess, which are the Martyrium of Polycarp and the Martyrium of the Martyrs of Lyon, they are actually letters. The letter of containing the martyrdom of Polycarp was written from his community, the community of Smyrna, to the community of Philomelium. Okay, so there must have been some kind of link between the two communities. The letter containing the martyrdoms of Lyon was written from the community of Lyon, therefore in Gaul, in France, to the churches of Phrygia in Asia Minor. Now, there is a long distance between Gaul and Asia Minor, okay, because we are literally crossing all over the Mediterranean, because the two are found at both ends of the Mediterranean basin. Now, the reason why this letter was written was actually because most of the people who were Christians in Lyon, in Lugdunum, were probably missionaries who had left the city of Phrygia and went to live in Lugdunum. Now, that is the first reference of Christianity that we find in Gaul. So this brings us to the conclusion. We shall be re-mentioning this in the future when we discuss Irenaeus of Lyon, because Irenaeus was from Asia Minor as well, and he was part of this community. It seems that there was this idea of sending a whole community as a missionary. So it was not just individuals or couples who went to work as missionaries in far-off lands, but sometimes you would find a whole community who would move from one city to the other end of the world in order to start a Christian community in another country. Now, in the case of the martyrs of Lyon, it seems that at some point the Gauls were unhappy with their presence, and therefore they made this very harsh persecution and killed most of them. Those who survived, amongst whom there was Irenaeus, they wrote this letter to the community of Phrygia, from where the community had left, in order to inform them about the death of members of their community. Okay, so it is very reasonable that the first accounts were actually letters with news updates. So, what do these letters contain? Now, like news updates, they give necessary details, which are sometimes quite gory, as we shall see when we read a particular text immediately after this section. However, they do not get derailed with too much reflection or philosophizing. Now, as we shall see in the text following this part, we do realize that there were some very short reflections, but literally they would take up, just a few words. Later texts would take pages and pages and pages of reflection. So here, the important thing was to narrate what happened and maybe to draw out some little lesson here and there. Okay, but as I said, when we read the text, the coming text, we shall understand this a bit better. So there isn't too much philosophizing on martyrdom or on Christianity or anything. It's simply a narration with a few tidbits of, some kind of reflection. The earliest hagiographic text that we know of is of this genre. The narrative element, written in the first person, because these are letters, and they are written obviously by eyewitnesses, people who actually saw the happenings, makes these texts quite readable. And as we said, the two most important and the oldest are these two, the martyrdom of Polycarp, which is quite short, and the account of the martyrdoms of Lyon, which is quite long. But the martyrdom is much more beautiful than the martyrdom of Polycarp. And therefore, now we shall read a short part from the martyrdoms of Lyon. Now, in the case of the martyrdoms of Lyon, there are a number of people who died. So the account first starts to speak about the community who was arrested, and then they start telling the story of each individual. Okay, so how each individual became a hero. And the most beautiful part is the story of Blandina, okay, this young, weak slave girl who was a Christian who was also arrested with her mistress. Okay, and the heroism shown by Blandina was certainly something which surprised the people, as we shall see. Okay, because as we said, she was a slave girl, therefore she was she had no value in society, and she was also a female, and she was weak in body. Okay, but what she endured was something which surprised even the pagans. So let's read the story of Blandina. Then at last the holy witnesses suffered tortures beyond all description. Satan striving eagerly that some of the evil reports might be acknowledged by them. Okay, so remember, Christians were persecuted because there were accusations against them. Okay, and these accusations were obviously inspired by Satan. So Satan was trying to make everything possible to get the Christians to admit that they had truly committed those crimes. But in an exceeding degree did the whole wrath of the mob, general and soldiers, fall on Blandina, through whom Christ showed that the things that to men appear mean and deformed and contemptible are with God deemed worthy of great glory, on account of love to him, a love which is not a mere boastful appearance, but shows itself in the power which it exercises over the life. So immediately Blandina is presented as an instrument of God. Christ used her to show how much he cherishes what society kind of throws away. For a while we were all afraid, and especially her mistress in the flesh, who was herself one of the combatants among the witnesses, that she would not be able to make a bold confession on account of the weakness of her body. Blandina was filled with such power that those who tortured her one after the other in every way, from morning till evening, were wearied and tired, confessing that they had been baffled, for they had no other torture they could apply to her, and they were astonished that she remained in life when her whole body was torn and opened up, and they gave their testimony that one only of the modes of torture employed was sufficient to have deprived her of her life, not to speak of so many excruciating inflictions. Okay, so immediately Blandina, who as we said was weak in body, is presented as a very, very strong hero. Okay, she is the one who, in her body, in her weakness, managed to endure everything. Okay, so we can see here Blandina moving towards perfection, towards literally divinization. But the Blessed Woman, like a noble athlete, recovered her strength in the midst of the confession, and her declaration, I am a Christian and there is no evil done among us, brought her refreshment and rest and insensibility to all the sufferings inflicted on her. So here we have the introduction of a very beautiful theme. The martyr who is compared to an athlete. What does an athlete do? An athlete exercises himself for the most important thing, which is the race, where he wants to win the crown. And this is what the martyrs do. Their whole lives, but especially torture, is their exercise. And it is through this exercise that they want to achieve victory. Now, here we have also another very real note, we can say. So, Blandina is said that when she confesses and when she declares that she's a Christian, she is refreshed, she rests, and she is insensible to the sufferings. Now, probably this is a way of hinting that her body was in shock. Now, when the body is in shock, it could become insensible to suffering, okay? Because it is suffering so much that literally the cells and the nerves which deal with suffering are almost already dead, and the person does not feel anything anymore, okay? So even here we find a very harsh realism, okay, of actual biological realities. But let's move on. Blandina was hung up and fastened to a stake and exposed as food to the wild beasts that were let loose against her. And through her presenting the spectacle of one suspended on something like a cross, and through her earnest prayers, she inspired the combatants with great eagerness. For in the combat they saw, by means of their sister, with their bodily eyes, him who was crucified for them, that he might persuade those who trust in him that every one that has suffered for the glory of Christ has eternal communion with the living God. So another important theme is introduced here. The martyr who becomes an alter Christus. Therefore, the martyr who is an embodiment of Christ. Now, Blandina was hung to a stake. Okay, so most probably this stake had somewhat the shape of a cross, okay, because she was hanging from it. And looking at her, her companions saw Christ crucified. Okay, so once again, the person reaching perfection becomes so united to Christ that the companions see Christ in her. Okay, and I believe all this is very, very beautiful. I mean, and it's also extremely deep, even though we don't find deep reflections. This is all extremely deep. And here, for example, these are the kind of reflections that we find in these texts. Okay, in her they saw by means of their sister with their body as him who was crucified for them, that he might persuade those who trust in him that everyone that has suffered for the glory of Christ has eternal communion with the living God. That is a reflection, but it's only that, okay? Just a few lines, there's a few words. As I said, in later texts, these would start to take whole pages. So, when none of the wild beasts at that time touched her, she was taken down from the stake and conveyed back to the prison. She was thus reserved for another contest, in order that gaining the victory in many preparative conflicts, she might make the condemnation of the crooked serpent unquestionable, and that she might encourage her brethren. So once again, the tortures, becoming always more harsh, were a kind of exercise. Now Blandina is slowly moving towards her ultimate sacrifice. Okay, therefore she is being prepared for a greater victory. An interesting detail here concerns the crooked serpent. Now here, most certainly the crooked serpent is referring to the serpent of Genesis, therefore the serpent that brought humanity to sin. So it is quite interesting that in this very early period, here we are in the year 177, okay? In this early period, Christians were already linking the evil around them to this very old image of the serpent found in the book of Genesis. Okay, so this shows that Christians were already starting to make use of symbolism. They were already starting to make important links between the realities of everyday life and images that are found in the Bible. And this shows, yes, that Christians had brains, okay, contrary to what many people used to believe in those times, that Christians were practically all fools and idiots. It means that they actually had brains, that they could make very important links between literature and reality. For though she was an insignificant, weak, and despised woman, yet she was clothed with the great and invincible athlete Christ. Okay, so the martyr who puts Christ on himself like a dress. Okay, this is also a very beautiful image. On many occasions, she had overpowered the adversary, and in the course of the contest, had woven for herself the crown of incorruption. Okay, so as we said earlier, the athletes used to make their best to win the crown of laurel, okay, the crown of the winners. The crown that the martyrdoms are seeking is the crown of incorruption. Okay, incorruption means everlasting life with God, but there is also a hint of what we said earlier in the previous part of the lecture. Okay, the idea of being given back the human body immediately upon reaching heaven. Okay, as a prize for what the body actually endured. Okay, so the incorruption in this case is also referring most probably to the body itself. After all these, on the last day of the gladiatorial shows, Blandina was again brought in along with Ponticus, a boy of about 15 years of age. These two had been taken daily to the amphitheatre to see the tortures which the rest endured, and force was used to compel them to swear by the idols of the heathen. But on account of their remaining steadfast and setting all their devices at naught, the multitude were furious against them, so as neither to pity the tender years of the boy nor to respect the sex of the woman. Accordingly, they exposed them to every terror and inflicted on them every torture, repeatedly trying to compel them to swear. But they failed in effecting this, for Ponticus, encouraged by his sister, So plainly indeed that even the heathen saw that it was she that encouraged and confirmed him, and after enduring nobly every kind of torture, gave up his spirit. While blessed Blandina, last of all, after having like a noble mother encouraged her children and sent them on before her victorious to the king, trod the same path of conflict which her children had trod, hastening on to them with joy and exultation at her departure, not as one thrown to the wild beasts, but as one invited to a marriage supper. Now, this image of the mother sending her children to God before her, does it remind you of anything? It should remind you of a very obscure story which we find in the second book of Maccabees. In the second book of Maccabees, which is found in the Old Testament, there is the story of the woman who had 7 sons. And the pagan governor of Palestine wanted them to offer sacrifices to idols, and they refused. And the governor orders the mother to tell her children to use her motherly methods of convincing her children to offer the sacrifices in order to save their lives. But their mother actually encourages them to hold fast and to die for their faith. And eventually, even she was killed. Now, Blandina here is compared to this mother. And once again, we start seeing this very advanced way of comparing real life people who lived at the time when these texts were written to images and verses of the Old Testament. Okay, this is how, in very indirect ways, the Christians started to see the Old Testament as a foreshadowing of the New Testament or of the life of the church. Okay, because they saw in this mother coming from the time of the Maccabees an image of Blandina and people like her who actually encouraged their brothers and sisters not to give up in front of torture and to hold fast to their faith and eventually dying themselves. And after she had been scourged and exposed to the wild beast and roasted in the iron chair, she was at last enclosed in a net and cast before a bull. And after having been well tossed by the bull, though without having any feeling of what was happening to her, through her hope and firm hold of what had been entrusted to her and her converse with Christ, she also was sacrificed. The heathens themselves acknowledging that never among them did woman endure so many and such fearful tortures. So once again, we have this idea that she was not feeling anything. Okay, as I said, probably she was in shock. But this does not diminish in any way her heroism. Okay, so Blandina finally dies. The bodies of the witnesses, after having been maltreated in every way and exposed in the open air for 6 days, were burned, reduced to ashes, and swept by the wicked into the river Rhone, which flows past, in order that not even a vestige of them might be visible on earth. Now, this is another important theme. The heathen, the pagans, destroy the body and burn it, and they let it throw the ashes in the Rhone in such a way that there is no way of recompiling and recomposing the body for the resurrection. Okay, so this seems to have been another trait of how can I say, of hatred towards the Christians. The heathens knew that the Christians believed in a bodily resurrection. So a further way of humiliating them was trying to stop them from having this bodily resurrection by destroying their bodies. Okay, so we can see a lot of things going on here. And these things they did as if they had been able to overcome God and deprive them of their second birth, in order, as they said, that they may not have hope in a resurrection, trusting to which they introduce some strange and new mode of worship, and despise dangers and go readily and with joy to death. Now let us see if they will rise again, and if their God can help them and rescue them out of our hands. So we can see here the hatred in a very practical way, not only towards the Christians, but also towards their beliefs. Okay, and this idea of creating some kind of new mode of worship actually hints that martyrs were already being venerated. Whenever martyrs' relics could be preserved, it seems that cults were growing. The people of Lugdunum simply did not want any cult of these martyrs to evolve, and therefore they destroyed their bodies completely and threw the relics, as we said, into the river. Now, in actual fact, I think the relics were, or at least according to tradition, they were collected, because there is a particular church in Lyon, which is not far from the river and at a little distance from the amphitheater where these people actually died, because the amphitheater still exists. There is a mosaic in the middle of the church giving the, representing a kind of a whirlpool. And in the whirlpool, there are the names of these martyrs in the mosaic. And according to tradition, that is the place where the relics are buried. Okay, so as we said, it's not far from the River Rhone, so someone actually did manage to get something. They buried them in this place, and eventually a church was built on this place. So let's say there is some kind of, I wouldn't say a happy ending, but a pleasant ending to this story. Okay, let's move on now to the Acts of the Martyrs, or as we call them in Latin, the Acta Martyrum. Now, around at the same time when this letter was written, another genre emerged. Now, it wasn't exactly when this letter was written, but it was between the letter of Polycarp, which was written 20 years earlier, and this letter. Okay, so we are roughly around year 160 now. Now, this new genre lacked the narrative element and was therefore much less popular. Okay, remember what made that letter of the martyrdoms of Lyon interesting, and similarly the letter with the martyrdom of Polycarp, it was actually the narrative element. People were like they were reading a short story with a very strong plot. Now, this new genre, the acta, were completely different. They had no narrative element and they were quite boring to read, actually. Anyway, these were literally the notes that were taken by the state secretaries during the verbal proceedings against the Christians. Okay, so I believe if any one of you had the misfortune of ever going to court, you would know that there would be someone writing down or typing every word. And these are the actual notes that were taken during these trials. Now, looking at these texts and the acts of the martyrs, one might get the impression that he is reading the script of a play. Okay, because you have the name of the person who is speaking and what he says. Then the name of the person who replies and what he or she is saying. Now, these manuscripts, remember, were written in the courts, so they were official documentation. They belonged to the state, not to the church. Okay? And like everything else in the past, these were kept in the libraries of each town. And therefore they were available. Okay, people could go and read them. They could go and copy them. They could go and steal them if they want. Okay, so in some way or another, let's say Christians managed to have copies in their possession of these acts. Now, as we said, they could have come from these in one way or another. Either someone went there and he copied what he saw, or else someone went there, he hid the manuscript and went out with it. Okay, but in any case, Christians managed to obtain copies. One good thing about these is that when large-scale persecutions took place, these texts were saved from destruction because they belonged to the state. Now, there were many cases when persecutions started with the destruction of Christian texts, be they liturgical texts, be they the Bible, or even these texts containing writings about the saints or even treatises. We know, for example, that the persecution of Diocletian, the last great persecution, started with the arrest of priests and with the confiscation of any texts belonging to Christians. So in this way, many texts were unfortunately lost. However, these acts, which were found in the libraries of the state, obviously they were not destroyed because they belonged to the state. They were not considered as Christian writings. So, basically, this feature promotes these very boring texts to the rank of being among the most authentic and important texts that we have related to hagiography. And one other thing that makes them quite important is because, as we said, since they come from a pagan source, they come from a source which is outside the church. Okay, they are therefore not biased in favor of the Christians. So it is, let's say, a more or less balanced source. Now, when Christians used to get copies, be it before the persecutions or even after the persecutions, when they kept copies for themselves, they used to add a couple of sentences. Okay, they would add a couple of sentences at the beginning in order to introduce the martyrs, and then a sentence at the very end to say how the martyrs were killed. We shall see very soon in an example. Now, the texts now followed a certain style. So there is the introduction, which usually includes the year when the events took place. Then there is the introduction of the main players who are mentioned, giving them specific titles. So the martyrs are called immediately saints, while the persecutors are labeled as impious or as evil. Then there is the actual text of the acts taken from the source, coming from the public library. And then at the very end, there is the death sentence that is pronounced. And another verse added by the Christians praising God for having called to himself these saints. Now let us see an example. So two of the most important acts are actually these two that you are seeing on the slide right now, the Acts of Justin and his companions and the Acts of the Martyrs of Scilium. Okay, now these are two firsts, we can say. The Acts of Justin and his companions is the first example of an acta martyrum that we possess. And it is written in Greek. Okay, it comes from Rome, from around the year 160. The Acts of the Martyrs of Scilium comes from North Africa, from the year 188. And it is written in Latin. And this is the first Latin text that we possess in the Christian world, we can say. So the first Latin text was not the Bible, it was not some important treatise, but it was a martyrial text. And therefore this shows how important this genre was, even in the development of the history of Christianity. We shall say something more about the Acts of Scilium later on. Now, let's read a short passage from the Acts of the Martyrs of Scilium. During the second term of the consulship of Presens and Condianus, on 17th of July in Carthage, there were led into the governor's office Speratus, Narzalus, and Cittinus, donata secunda vestia. So there we have the introduction of the martyrs. Saturninus the governor said, "You can have mercy from our Lord the Emperor if you return to your senses." Speratus said, "We have never done wrong. We have stayed clear of treating people unfairly. We have never spoken ill of anyone. Instead, when treated badly, we have offered thanks because we obey our own ruler." Saturninus the governor said, "We too are religious, and our religion is simple. We swear by the birth spirit of our Lord the Emperor and offer sacrifices for his health, which you must do as well." Remember, these were Roman citizens, so they were expected to participate in these very important ceremonies, which, in a way or another, also paid homage to the emperor. Speratus said, "If you are prepared to listen to me, I will tell you a mystery of simplicity." Saturninus said, "If you're going to tell bad things about our sacred rituals, I will not listen to you. Rather, swear by the birth spirit of our Lord the Emperor." Speratus said, "I do not acknowledge the authority of this world, but I rather serve that God whom no one has seen or can see with these eyes. I have never been guilty of theft, but whenever I buy, I pay tax, because I acknowledge my Lord, the King of Kings and the ruler of all peoples. Now, this verse shows something very important about the Christians. The Christians took very good care to be good citizens, not because they felt obliged to obey the Romans, but because as followers of Christ, as subjects of this King of Kings, who is the ruler of all peoples, who is God, it was morally important for them to obey rules and to obey laws. Okay, so Christians lived a life as good citizens because of the fact that they were Christians, not because they felt some kind of obligation towards the state. So, in some way, we can say that the Christians were actually beneficial for the empire, because if everyone followed these instructions, there wouldn't be any tax evasion, there wouldn't be any murder, there wouldn't be any theft. Okay, so it would be a very idyllic and beautiful place to be in. Anyway, let's go on. Saturninus, the governor, said to the others, "Stop being of this persuasion." So remember that Speratus was not alone, there were the other five. Okay, stop being of this persuasion. Speratus said, "Bad is the persuasion to commit murder, to bear false testimony." Saturninus, the governor, said to Speratus, "Do you persevere in being a Christian?" Saturninus said, "I am a Christian," and all uttered their agreement with him. Saturninus, the governor, said, "Do you want some time to consider the matter carefully?" Speratus said, "In such a just case, there is no need for careful consideration." Saturninus, the governor, read out the sentence from a tablet. Concerning Speratus, Narsalus, Gittinus, Donata, Vestia Secunda, and the others who have confessed that they live according to the Christian religion, because in spite of the opportunity given to them to return to the Roman way of life, they have stubbornly persisted in maintaining theirs. I have decided that they be put to the sword. Speratus said, "We offer thanks to God." And immediately they were decapitated for the name of Christ. Amen. So that is an example of an act of martyrs. Okay, as you can see, there is just a discussion. There aren't any theological, digressions. It's simply people who are holding fast to their faith and trying to explain why there is nothing wrong in what they believe. Now, in this particular text, in the final part in this slide, you can see a trait which is not very common in martyrial texts. The governor is actually trying to bring them back to their senses. Okay, he is telling them, look, if you persist in this madness, you will lose your lives. Think about it. Consider the matter carefully. Okay, so it's almost as if Saturninus was actually trying to save them. Okay, in this particular text, you don't find the hatred that you find in other texts. Okay, so it is quite a unique text, I would say, the martyrs of the martyrdom of the martyrs of Scilium. And there are another couple of details. I don't know whether I will mention them later in the lecture, but I can tell them now immediately because they are quite interesting. Now, the reason why these martyrs were arrested was because they were accused of having books with the letters of St. Paul. And this little detail gives us a lot of information. First and foremost, as we said, we are in North Africa. The North Africans did not speak Greek. So by the year 188, the letters of St. Paul had certainly been translated into Greek. Another interesting feature is that they are described as being carried in books. The text speaks of codices, and a codex is literally a book, okay? Therefore, a certain amount of pages, which are put one on top of the other and which are sewn on the side in order to keep them in order. Now, books were much more convenient to carry when you are traveling than scrolls, because, I mean, the proper way back then of having a library was to have a number of scrolls. And what was a scroll? A scroll was a long piece of paper or of parchment, which used to be written only on one side and which then used to be rolled. And if you wanted a whole book, it would be written, obviously, on a certain number of scrolls, which used to be put in a bag or in a sack and then carried from one place to another. But what are the dangers of having a scroll library? Obviously, scrolls can get lost. Papers can get lost. If you are traveling on a horse and your sack falls and all the scrolls scatter, you can leave something behind. And when you put them back, you might not put them in order. A book, a codex, frees you from all these difficulties, okay? Because the pages are put one after the other and they are sewn. So there is no way of getting pages, changing their places. And apart from that, it is much easier to carry a book than it is to carry a sack of scrolls. Now, the interesting thing is that this is here the first mention of a book that we find in world history. So it seems that the idea of a book, of a number of pages put one on top of the other and sewn, actually comes from the Christians of North Africa. Okay, this is the first time that a book is mentioned in human history. And I think this is very interesting, okay, because this is what makes studying literature and the context quite interesting, because it gives us also these details which have nothing to do with Christianity, they have nothing to do with martyrs, but they present us a very important point of evolution in human society, the invention of the book. And it is found actually in a Christian text coming from North Africa dealing with martyrs. Anyway, let's move on. Many other texts that belong to Christians, like the letters containing the martyria, as we have said, were destroyed during the persecutions. And eventually, these were replaced by other texts written from what the new authors remembered. Okay, and obviously these contained many additions, making them nearly fictional tales. And these are the passiones, the passions. Now, let's try to put ourselves in context. Let's take the martyrs of Lyon, for example, as a particular example. During the last persecution, all the versions of the martyrdoms of Lyon were lost because they were destroyed. But obviously people would have read them. And in order to preserve the memory, people would try to rewrite what they remembered. Obviously, they would forget some details, and they would know that they are forgetting details, so they add on other details in order to fill in the blanks. And many times, you would feel this urge to make the text a bit more in your style, to include in the text maybe questions that you yourself ask, or even justifications that you yourself believe, or reflections that you think. Okay, so that is how these texts evolved. Okay, from a historical account, they became something which is more different, much longer, and which sometimes loses the focus. Now, it is important to point out at this point that not all passions are actually a work of fiction. The earliest examples are certainly authentic texts retelling real historical events. Later texts, especially texts which come after the 4th century, have a historical center, but the retelling is largely fantastical. Okay, now in this case, I try to bring two examples. Now, I am from Zurich. Okay, I am a very great devotee of St. Catherine of Alexandria. And I also have, let's say, affiliations with the parish of St. George in Gozo. Okay, so I am quite devout to St. George as well. Now, these are two actual examples of people who, let's take St. George. St. George certainly lived, okay, because even popes speak of St. George. St. Catherine of Alexandria is a bit more doubtful, okay, but certainly her persona was inspired by a historical person. Now, the stories that we read about St. George and St. Catherine are actually quite amazing, okay, in such a way that whoever is reading would say, but it is very improbable that whatever is said about them is actually true. Now, this is, as I said, the last period of the writing of passions. Okay, because the original passions, as we shall see, were very historical and concrete texts. later texts start to be, these nice fictional moral stories. So I will be bringing some examples from the lives and the martyrdoms of these two saints, which, as I said, I am not putting in doubt their historicity. It is only what is said about them that is quite questionable. Now, let's try to think a bit of the word passion. Okay, now speaking of passion, one brings to mind the Passion of Christ. Okay, so the main aim of this genre was to show the martyrs going through their own Calvary for the love of their faith. However, there is a deeper meaning. The Latin term passio also refers apart from the physical suffering to the spiritual or the moral affliction of a person. And therefore, in these texts, we find hints of early psychology, wherein the thoughts and the feelings of the martyrs are discussed, especially when they understand that their choices will bring the end of their life, and when they weigh the stakes when they are offered freedom by apostasy. Now, what does this mean? I will bring an example from the title, from the text whose title has just appeared on the screen, okay? The Passion of Perpetua and Felicitas. Now, this is one of the authentic passions, okay? It was written around the year 203. Part of it was written by Perpetua herself, and it is an account of what this lady passed through in her last days. Now, Perpetua was a catechumen, okay? She was therefore preparing for baptism. So, as we said earlier, she was not baptized formally in her life, but her baptism was her martyrdom. Some days before she was arrested, she had just given birth. And she speaks about what she felt when she was separated from her baby. She also speaks about her breasts, which hurt, okay, because obviously her body had produced milk, but since the baby was not with her, she could not breastfeed him, so her breasts were swollen and they were hurting. On a particular occasion, her father, who was still a pagan, visits his daughter in prison, taking the baby with him. And he kind of tries to convince her, first, out of respect towards his old age, to turn back from Christianity and live with him. And then, out of respect of her own child, how can you leave this child without a mother? Just in order to be stubborn and continue persisting in this new religion that you are following. Okay, so, and Perpetua writes about her thoughts, about the Calvary that she was going through. Okay, so here we start seeing literally some early examples of psychology. What is the person going through in his own brain and in his own soul, in his spirit, not simply what is he suffering in his body. Okay, so this is where passions start to get interesting. The style is very similar to the martyria. Okay, in fact, the passions were, I would say, literally a development of the martyria. They are all a narrative story, just like the martyria, but whereas the martyria dealt only with the short period between the arrest of the person and his death, okay, the passiones, especially the later passiones, were more, more sprawling, we can say. Sometimes they start from the moment when the person becomes a Christian, and they speak about the great things of the great acts of generosity that he makes, the witness that he gives in public of his faith, the journeys, the voyages that the person does. Okay, and then eventually they come to the moment of his arrest, his trial, his speech, his very long speech, and his martyrdom. Okay, so passions are more extended than the martyrs, the martyria. Passions are actually novels, okay? So they are reading books intended obviously to edify whoever is reading them. but they are not simply intended on presenting the martyrdom account of the person. It is roughly more of a biography. So, whereas the martyria, as we said, were always found in letters, the Passiones are written as independent stories about heroes. Okay, and they were actually read in private by people. Now, what happened to these texts and their development after the end of the persecutions? Um, this is the last part of this lecture. So, the end of the persecutions in the early 4th century, thanks to Constantine, marked the end of the production of martyria and acta, but not of the passiones. Okay, so certainly, since there were no more martyrdoms going on, there were no news updates to send to other communities. And likewise, since there were no more trials taking place against Christians, there was no occasion to write these trials as they did before. However, the passions continued to develop. Okay, people still wrote stories, and this is where they start writing stories about martyrs. Okay, so they would remember the story of a particular martyr, maybe whose texts were lost, and they built his own biography or her biography. Now, the stories of female saints in this period started to become very, very popular. Okay, and this is quite easy to understand why, I believe, because the story of a female who is showing that she is as strong as a male is something remarkable. As I said, when the letter containing the martyrdoms of Leon was written, it speaks about each and every character, and there were many males, but it is the story of Blandina which remained most known. Okay, because the story of a woman enduring what a man hardly can endure is something which surprises and which interests people. Okay, so it is in this period that the stories of female martyrs start to become literally bestsellers. Now, the content of the Passiones after the era of the persecutions, however, went at a tangent, giving more importance to the fantastical element and the imaginary element. Okay, so it was no longer the case of wanting to write a historically correct biography. It was simply presenting the person as a superhuman. Okay, so the historical core, in some way or another, was always present. Okay, I will bring again the example of Saint Catherine. Certainly, the figure of Saint Catherine was inspired by a historical woman from Alexandria. But then the stories about her are something which the authors probably invented or which they got from the stories of different martyrs and put them together in the figure of what nowadays is called Saint Catherine. So, the historical core was always present, but it was buried in an annexed series of stories of fantasy and of miracles in order to show the heroism of the martyrs in front of their torturers' cruelty. And this cruelty became more and more depraved with the passing of the years. Okay, with the passing of the years, I mean with the passing of the years when people were writing these stories. Now, this was particularly the case in places like Rome. So, texts which were produced in Rome were many times more fantastical than texts produced, for example, in the East. Why was this so? In the East, there was still the tradition of meeting on the tomb of the martyr on the anniversary of his or her martyrdom and read their biography, their martyrium or their acta, or even their passion if the passions were written before the last persecution. So, if you have a liturgical context where this text is being read in public, some kind of control and containment on the fantastical element was practiced, okay, because obviously people would remember from year to year what had happened, what they had heard the year before. So you cannot just invent a new episode and people would, just stay there without reacting. So whenever texts are read in public, it is very difficult for these texts to evolve because people remember. In cities like Rome, on the other hand, these texts were intended to be read in private. So in Rome, there wasn't this tradition of meeting on the tomb of the martyr and read his or her acts. But rather, these books were written for private use. So people who read in private would not be comparing what they had listened to or heard the year before. So the authors found this context quite comfortable in order for them to feel free to add as much fantasy as they wished to the historical details. Okay, so why did they do this? They did not do this, I mean, simply to show their talent as, fiction authors, but in order to make the text more interesting, in order to please whoever is reading, in order to present the saint in, a larger form than he actually was. Okay, so it was, let's say, all with a good intention. All right, it was not always the best way, but it was always a good intention. Anyway, so this is what was the situation after the last great persecution. The Passions enjoyed incredible popularity for the arc of a millennium. Okay, so till the late Middle Ages, Passions were still being written. And now the following are some features which were common in practically all of them. Okay, those which were written between, let's say, the year 350 and 1350. Okay, so 1,000 years. These were all present, and these were the elements which actually pleased the readers and which therefore became more and more underlined. Now, I could give you an example where you can find all these elements which I should be mentioning now. You can read the Golden Legend of Saint Jacobus of Voragine. Okay, now the Golden Legend was written in the High Middle Ages. It is a collection of stories of saints where all these fantastical elements are all present. Okay, so you can read, you don't need to read the whole book, okay, because it is never ending. But you can read the 2 or 3 stories of saints there, okay, and you will see all these elements present. Now, what are these elements? First and foremost, the persecution was always presented as being introduced by an emperor who was known to be evil. Okay, therefore, a historical emperor who hated Christians like Decius, like Maximinus, like Diocletian. Okay, so these were people who really created persecutions. But their names would be put in these texts, even if they are dealing with a martyr who lived in a different time. Okay, now Saint Catherine, according to tradition, lived or died in the early 4th century. Therefore, she lived in Egypt, so it was under the rule of Maxentius. Sometimes Maxentius was used also for martyrs who lived in the 2nd century, for example. Or Diocletian, who was emperor between the 3rd and the 4th century, was used for persecutions in the 1st century. Okay, so chronology was thrown out of the window. The emperor always has a cohort of evil men that take the roles of corrupt magistrates or torturers. Okay, it was never the emperor who did the dirty work. He was the one who gave orders, and then his team did the work. Sometimes one of these would be converted by the Christian who is dying. Okay, so remember, I always said the Christians gave these very long speeches, and sometimes, let's say, they hit home, and someone used to convert. And this person ends up being killed either with the martyr or immediately before him. And in many cases, a prodigy, some kind of miracle, would take place during the martyrdom where many or all of the torturers get killed with the artifices that they created to torture the martyr. And once again, I bring in the picture my dear Saint Catherine. Okay, now in the story of Saint Catherine, Maximinus, the emperor or the governor, whatever he was, he tried to convince her to quit being a Christian, telling her that Christianity was a religion for ignorant people. She came from Alexandria, she was an intelligent woman, so she should not be a Christian. And therefore, he brings 50 philosophers in order to convince this young girl. And surprise, surprise, she converts them to Christianity. The 50 philosophers are immediately burned, and Catherine is made to watch their martyrdom. Okay? And she is all the time encouraging them not to give up while the flames were actually destroying their bodies. So, these are the cases that we have seen. Okay? The martyr who gives a very important speech and convinces the people who are set against her. Apart from that, Catherine had to be killed with a spiked wheel. Okay, these used to be, at least from the pictures, this is the image that we can get. Okay, imagine two wheels turning in opposite directions. Okay, and with the wheel there would be spikes of iron. Now the person is put in the center. These two wheels turning in different directions are always getting closer, 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 and they start tearing the person to pieces. Now, this was built in order to cut Saint Catherine to pieces, but at some point this artifice broke, it fell on the torturers, and all the torturers were killed. Okay, so we find all these miracles even in these stories. Now, since these texts try to present themselves as historical texts and historical accounts, in many cases the stories are narrated by a supposed eyewitness. Now, the detail in which the stories enter give the impression that these eyewitnesses, who present themselves as the authors of these texts, had been granted some kind of privileges to accompany the martyrs in jail and also on the gallows, asking them questions while he is literally being prepared to be killed. Okay? And they are given the opportunity to record their famous last words. Now, obviously, yes, Christians were given permission to have visitors in jail. But certainly they would not be able to follow them all the way to the gallows and asking them, famous last words while the axe is going down to cut off their heads. Okay, so this is just to make the readings a bit more interesting. A particular eyewitness who appears as the author of a number of Passiones was an Egyptian who was called Julius of Akfas. Okay, and he supposedly wrote eyewitness accounts coming from all over Egypt. Okay, so he spent his life going from one city to another, meeting martyrs on their way to death and writing whatever they told him, until eventually he obviously got killed himself. Okay, this is how they always end. Another important good character is the person who used to collect the remains of the martyrs from the arena in order to give them a proper burial. Now, the importance of proper burial was something which was very real in the Christian community. Okay, we find texts coming from the late first century, sorry, from the late second century and early third century, wherein Christians speak of collections made during the Eucharist in order to give proper burial to the dead members who could not afford a grave in the common cemetery. And eventually, we start reading that Christians were buying lands, plots of land, in order to build their own cemeteries to bury their dead. Okay, so proper burial was something which was taken very seriously. And therefore, in these stories, we find these characters who go to the arena and collect the bits and pieces in order to bury them. Many times, these barriers, let's call them barriers, remain unnamed. However, there are two which remained very well known. One of them was Lucina. Lucina was one of the most famous barriers of martyrs in these passions. Now, did Lucina truly exist? We don't know. What we know for certain is that in Rome, there is a church called San Lorenzo in Lucina. Now, whenever there is this particular toponym in Lucina or in Damaso, for example, it means that this particular church was built on the estates of the person whose name is included with that of the martyr. Okay, so San Lorenzo in Lucina. So probably this church was built on the estates of this lady called Lucina. she must have been devout of Saint Lawrence, and therefore she built a church in his honor. And in some way, this church procured an iron grate, which according to tradition was the iron grate on which St. Lawrence was barbecued. Okay? We'll put aside the fact that St. Lawrence was not barbecued. In actual fact, he was beheaded, but never mind that. Anyway, so it seems that a Lucina truly did exist. But is she the same Lucina who is mentioned in these martyrdom accounts? Most probably not, because first and foremost, she is mentioned for the first time in the apocryphal Acts of Paul and Thecla, which are set in the 1st century. So if Lucina truly existed, or else if this is the same Lucina, she was born in the 1st century. And she continues to appear in accounts of martyrdoms, always burying Christians, till the beginning of the 4th century. So this lady must have lived 300 years. Okay, so certainly it's either not the same person. I mean, it's certainly not the same person, so it could have been either a number of people who remain unnamed and they are given the name of this lady who lived in Rome in the 3rd century, because Lawrence was killed in the 3rd century. And they all got her name, or else she was a completely fictitious figure who happened to have the same name as this historical lady who lived in Rome. Another more interesting case is that of Saint Praxedes, who was a Roman or aristocrat. Now, she did not go to the arena to collect bones and pieces of body, but she used to go to the arena to collect the blood of the martyrs. Okay, she used to go with buckets and pieces of cloth. She used to gather the blood, rinse the cloth in the bucket, and eventually she would go and drain this bucket in a well. And this well still exists. It is found in the Basilica of St. Praxedes, of course, in Rome, which is found very close to Santa Maria Maggiore. So if you go to Rome, if you have Santa Maria Maggiore literally at your back, as you can see University at my back, this church is on the right. Okay, it is in a small alley on the right. Okay, so it is worth a visit. It's a beautiful church, very old, and there is still this well. Now, how does the story of Praxedes finish? Praxedes was actually surprised while she was doing this. She was arrested and she was killed herself. Unfortunately, her her torturers did not have the very bright idea of throwing her in the well, because that would have been quite an adequate ending to her story, but they did not have that idea, so she was simply beheaded or something, and her relics were eventually collected, and they are found also in this church dedicated to her. Now, as we have said, all the martyrs give long theological speeches during their questioning, okay? Now, when I say long, I mean long. Okay, they would take dozens of pages, and sometimes even in the stories themselves, the governor, at the end of the day would say, "Look, stop, and we'll continue listening to you tomorrow." And this would go on for days. Okay, so imagine the martyr speaking for days on end, speaking about his faith and about anything related to the faith, and sometimes also going to tangents. The days are postponed, and finally, when they can have no more of this, they would eventually kill the martyr. Okay, and once again, I say, I think in this case, the martyrs are bringing it on themselves. Okay, because even I would not be able to hear a person ranting for days on end on the same subject. Okay, so anyway, so as I said, sometimes maybe the martyrs are to blame as well. Tortures. Now, these feature in all these texts, okay? These are very important elements and very important ingredients. And these keep on getting worse. Historically, we know that the Romans used tortures and executions such as beheading, such as burning, and being fed to animals, and also crucifixion. So those are truly historical ways of getting rid of people. But in the Passiones of the 4th century and afterwards, we find people who are killed by drowning, people who are killed by roasting, St. Lawrence, people who are killed by spiked wheat, St. Catherine and St. George, people who are tortured with hot iron scissors, Saint Agatha, for example. People who are starved to death, or, I mean, they never die, but anyway, who are starved. Saint Catherine was left for a whole year in a desert, and she did not die. People who are poisoned, like Saint George. Okay, so anything that is imaginable. Okay, and then these are where reading starts to get quite weird and quite interesting. Now, when all of these actually fail, the person is beheaded, and usually beheading solves the problem. Not always, but it usually solves the problem. An important ingredient in these texts is also the element of fantasy, which takes the form of numerous miracles that take place in favor of the martyrs to be, in order either to save them from torments and torture, or else to convert the people who are torturing them. How do these miracles happen? Now, the martyrs are given superhuman powers to resist pain. Okay, we already have a hint of this in the martyrdom of Blandina, which we have read. So they are given superhuman powers to resist pain to the extent that the torturers at times have to stop for a rest. Okay, once again, Blandina comes to mind. The tortures inflicted on St. George, for example, and the attempts to kill him took 7 years. Now, St. George is called a megalomartyr. Megalomartyr not simply because he's a great martyr, but because he went through a number of martyrdoms. They tried to kill him with 7 different methods. Okay, they tried to poison him, they tried to starve him, they tried to beat him to death, they tried to tear him to pieces with a spiked wheel, they tried to burn him. I don't know the 6th one, and eventually he was beheaded. Okay, the dragon was not one of the tortures. Okay, the dragon was something which came up later. Anyway, so that is why he's a megalomartyr, because they tried to kill him for 7 years, okay, with a different martyrdom each year. Saint Clement was tortured for 28 years. Surprise. Now, intricate torture machines were devised, and these eventually, for some reason, miraculous reason, they do not work on the martyr, but they work perfectly on the heathen. Okay, once again, I remind you the story of the spiked wheel of Saint Catherine. Okay, as soon as the wheel started turning and was approaching the body of the martyr, it broke down and it killed anyone who happened to be underneath it. Apart from these, we do find other strange occurrences. Like, for example, a person is thrown to the beasts, at the bestias. Okay, now the beasts refuse to eat the martyrs, but whenever the soldiers come and they try to kill the martyrs themselves, the lions would eat and maul the soldiers. Okay, a person is thrown into a flame. Okay, the fire refuses to burn the person because it would die out. And then as soon as the torturers go to get the person out of the furnace immediately flares up again and it burns the torturers. People who are killed with arrows are thrown at them and the arrows just turn around and kill whoever threw the arrow. Okay, Saint Sebastian did not have this luxury. Okay, so the arrows actually reached him, but he did not die with the arrows. Okay, Saint Sebastian actually died later on after being healed by a lady called Irene. He was beaten to death in the court of Diocletian because he thought he was a ghost. Now, which is the best way to chase a ghost away is by trying to hit it. Okay, so he sent people with sticks to hit the ghost of Saint Sebastian. Saint Sebastian was no ghost, and he died with the wounds that he got through this beating. But never mind. And so these are all these different details which make these stories very, very interesting to read. And the last thing is that sometimes these martyrs refused to die. Okay, for example, as we said, St. George, 7 years of martyrdom. St. Catherine, she was left in the desert to starve. She was beaten. She had to be torn to pieces with spiked wheels, and then eventually she was decapitated and she remained dead in that case. Okay. Others, however, did not. Now, sometimes martyrs are inflicted with deadly wounds, but they are miraculously healed and they come back kind of for more torture. Now, a very clear example is the story of Saint Agatha. Saint Agatha had her breast chopped off with iron scissors, okay, and she had to bleed to death. However, St. Peter visited her at night and he gave her a brand new pair of breasts, okay, so all her wounds were healed, and eventually she was thrown in a furnace. She was they did many things to her, but I think at last they cut her head off, and she remained dead as well. However, there are those martyrs who refuse to die even with beheading. Okay, there is, for example, Saint Denis of Paris, there is Saint Nicasius of Reims, and also Saint Aphrodisius of Egypt. They were decapitated, but they stood up, they carried their heads in their hands, and they went to their burial site, okay, with their heads still talking. Okay, so we do find these fantastical stories which certainly could not have happened, but which make very interesting reading. Okay, once again, I refer you to the golden legend of Jacobus. Okay, so look it up, it is available online, and you can read a couple of these stories just to understand the degradation, I would say, of the martyrial kind of literature, hagiography, especially in the Middle Ages. Okay, so with that, on a happy note, we conclude this lecture. Thank you for your attention, and we'll meet for our next topic very soon. Thank you.